Hey guys, good morning. Sorry I can't be there today. I'm hoping to be there Monday, but we'll see. But I just didn't want you guys to get behind the other class. So I'm recording this video. I know it's not ideal, but it's better than struggling and not doing as well on the test. So pay attention like you normally do. Make sure to be taking notes when things are underlined. I am going to do my best to go slow enough that everyone should be able to write it down. But since I can't see you, it's kind of hard to tell sometimes. So do your best at keeping up. And I hope I get the timing about right. But we'll just get started here so we can get through as much as possible. I believe we stopped about here last time when we got to Archduke Ferdinand and his epic mustache. He was assassinated by the guy in the bottom right. His name was Princip. He was a Serbian nationalist. He assassinated, he was a terrorist, but he assassinated Archduke Ferdinand. That got blamed on Serbia because he was a Serbian. It wasn't really Serbia's fault, but the Austro-Hungarians were mad, and so they attacked Serbia. And this was relatively a small thing. I mean, this has happened in the past before when there hasn't been as much tension between different nations, and it resulted in some ugliness, but it didn't result in a world war. But because all of these other tensions were already existent, they already were there, this was just enough to push everything into overdrive and make everything go crazy. So when the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia, it resulted in Russia acting because Russia had an agreement, a peace treaty with Serbia. So they declared war on the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Well, Germany had an alliance with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they declared war on Russia, who had a treaty with France and Great Britain. So they declared war on Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? It goes back and forth. Everybody declared war on everybody else. So most of the countries that joined World War I did so because they were a part of an alliance. And in order to follow through with their deals, they ended up having to join this war, even though really the thing that started it had nothing to do with most of these countries. I'll give you just a second to write this down. Sorry. Sorry, I hope you can't hear my fish tank. I can hear it really loud, but I don't think you can. But if you can, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm gonna move. 3, 2, 1, blast off. So this shows kind of how complicated this was. On the right here, the red ones, you have the Triple Entente and their alliance with each other. The Triple Alliance there in the blue, and then some others kind of got caught in the middle of all this madness. But you can see how quickly things, if you get mad at one of these groups, then all of a sudden it explodes into a much, much bigger issue. So the Ottoman Empire was late to this war, basically. In the beginning, they hadn't joined a side, and both groups were trying to get them on their side. Germany wanted to have access to the Ottoman Empire as an ally because it would help them have better access to Africa and help them have better access to those resources to help them fight this war. Britain wanted them because it would also help them with transportation. Having access to the Egypt area was important for sure during this time. In the end, though, the Triple Alliance was who the Ottoman Empire chose to join, which would end up being a bad choice, but they couldn't have known that in the beginning. This is what one reason the Ottoman Empire was so keen to join our side, even though really this conflict didn't have anything to do with them. They were quickly losing power. Over the last about 100 years before this point, their empire had been whittled away piece by piece by piece. Each of these areas they used to control, and you can see the year that they lost control of them. So it kind of started with Algeria over there, or Greece really first, but about 1830-ish, they start losing some of their power. And then over time, it's more and more of it's gone. And by the time the war starts, they've lost Crete right next to them. They've lost Albania, and now they're just scrambling to try and change this backward slide that they're experiencing, you could say, hoping to gain some of their glory back, basically. right, so that's the first slideshow. I'm going to move on to the next one. We're going to go through quite a bit, so focus, peeps. All right, so this is where World War I really gets started. One interesting thing about World War I that kind of changed from prior wars is that countries started using something that we now call total war effort. It basically means that the whole country is working together to fight in the war. Many wars before this were really just the soldiers working in them and maybe the government working through this war. But as this war became so massive and important, everyone needed to help in order to help their country do better in the war. This meant that, for example, men were going off to fight in the war. Women would replace them in factories to make the munitions that the men needed to fight with, right? They were the ones making the bullets. They were making bombs. They were making airplanes and things like that eventually. And children were even a part of this because rationing at home, using less of your stuff, so that you could send more things to the soldiers on the front lines was a huge thing. Kids were a part of that. But they even had some kids going out and collecting metal off the side of the road, like collecting trash basically to be recycled. This was a part of the war effort. So everybody had something to contribute during this time. But really one of the big changes besides that total war effort idea, the big things that changed this war are actually technology. These new inventions start to change how we fight war forever. Some big ones, machine guns. Machine guns were really interesting because before this, I mean, we go back 50 years, 60 years or so, and guns were muzzle loaders. They were one shot, and then it usually took you, if you were good, you could reload one of those in maybe 15 seconds. That would be like super fast. The average person was probably more like 30 seconds to reload and then fire again. That's one shot every 30 seconds or 20 if you're lucky. Not much firepower for an individual soldier to have. You needed a lot of people firing their guns at the same time, or staggering their fire to really do much in terms of damage to anything. With a machine gun, one weapon, one gun could fire as much as several hundred soldiers before this point. This one gun could fire 200 rounds per minute. They were firing so fast actually that the heat from the bullets and the friction that was generated from that would actually melt the barrels within minutes. And they had to come up with some innovations to try and solve that problem. One of the big ones was a water-cooled barrel. So they'd actually have a barrel that went through a tank of water, and that water would boil off and steam off, and somebody had to be refilling this water tank pretty regularly to keep the gun from melting. It's kind of crazy. Here's a picture of one. I know you can't see that very well, and I'm sorry. To try and fit all of these inventions, I had to have a little tiny picture. It's so cute. But these were not a one-person thing. Nowadays, you see people, carrying around these automatic weapons that are pretty small, not very heavy, not much more heavier than a normal rifle anyway. That was not what the first machine guns were. The first machine guns were usually a 5 or 6 man job. Somebody was there to help carry the machine. Somebody was there to load. Somebody was there to fire. Somebody's there to refill the water and get more ammunition, right? It was a team effort for most machine guns. You didn't really carry these around usually. They would be behind a barricade of some sort, and it would basically stay there most of the time. If you move forward, you would move your machine guns one at a time so that they wouldn't be out of commission. All of them wouldn't be out of commission at the same time anyway. Big deal. It wasn't just carrying it around on your hip like we see, like in your video games nowadays. Flamethrowers, excuse me, another cool one. Kind of scary and horrifying. By kinda, I mean terribly horrifying. We're going to talk about how this war was fought in trenches. And if you are stuck in a hole, you can imagine the terror of somebody with a flamethrower. Hard to escape this. And one big difference between a normal gun is that the flamethrower that spreads the fire. This basically is a long-term thing, and it can help clear out things like bunkers and stuff pretty well, pretty effectively, but in a horrible way. Airplanes started being used in war for the first time here. Airplanes at this point had been a pretty new invention. And at first they were used mostly for scouting out, just looking down and seeing where enemies were. But people started realizing, hey, while I'm up here, why don't I throw a grenade over the side? Or why don't I mount a gun onto this? It took a while to get the guns mounted on them right. Pilots ended up shooting down themselves quite often because they would use the machine gun and shoot through their propellers, and then they wouldn't be able to get the momentum they needed moving forward. So kind of an interesting thing. They had to get timing just right on those eventually. But pretty cool new way to fight. It's kind of an interesting thing about human psychology that we learned during this war. The average soldier never looked up during the war. They didn't look up because that's not normally where a threat is. There aren't really any major animals that, if you're under a tree, you might look up because you're looking up into the tree. But when you're out in the open, there's no need to look up. There's not a threat above you usually. But now there was a threat above us, and people didn't learn that very quickly. The average person didn't look up at an airplane until it was already above them, already attacking them. And so these pilots actually thought they were pretty clever, coming in and shooting a machine gun at people who weren't even looking up yet. And they might even giggle. But the funny thing was that some pilots were better at also looking up themselves than others. So as these pilots were strafing people on the ground who weren't looking up, they also weren't looking up, and somebody would come up behind them, above them, and shoot them down. Some of these men that were really aware of their surroundings more than others became fantastic pilots. Some of them became super aces. To become an ace, you had to shoot down 5 enemy planes, but super aces were those who are aces multiple times. And some of them shot down upwards of 100 other planes because they were more aware and they were really good at flying. Kind of cool development there. Of course, airplanes are a big part of war now. Tanks were another big one. Not what you would expect a tank to look like from today's perspective. One of the major reasons people developed tanks in the first place was to have an armored vehicle in front of you as you walked towards the enemy trench, toward the enemy lines. You wanted to have something in front of you that would block bullets. And so a lot of the tanks at first, some of them didn't even have guns. They just basically were a moving shield. And then they developed over time. This one has this weird angle like that because they want to be able to angle into a trench and then come up out of it on the other side. Kind of a cool design. Okay, then poisonous gas. These were horrible things. Most of them they're actually all outlawed now in war. People still unfortunately use them sometimes, but then you get the whole world mad at you if you do that. But some of the worst ones were like mustard gas. That was a bad one. People who have experienced it and survived to tell the tale would basically tell you that it feels like being burned from the inside out. You're lit on fire on the inside. There's no way you can fight that fire. It attacks your nerves. And eventually cripples and kills you a lot of the time if you're exposed to enough of it. But even just a small amount of exposure just on your skin, it's not something you necessarily even have to breathe in. Exposure on your skin would basically create a horrible burn, but it was on the inside instead of the outside. Really, really scary stuff. And then submarines. Cool thing about this, they're called in German Unterseeboots. Sounds kind of crazy, but really it just means unter, sea, water, sea, right? Boot is just boat. So the Germans, they don't make up fancy names. They just say it and we think it sounds cool, like Volkswagen sounds so interesting. It just means people car. So anyway, when underwater boats, on Unterseeboots, we end up just calling them U-boats. When the German submarines are just called U-boats because we're lazy. We'll talk about some of that in just a second. But that really changed how we fought the war. These generals, unfortunately, at the beginning, though, weren't used to these new weapons. They were used to fighting the same way for hundreds of years. Things hadn't really changed that much. And so with these new inventions, these new developments, some generals learned very slowly, unfortunately, and it cost a lot of lives. Some of these generals would order their men to charge machine gun nests. And sometimes it worked, but most of the time it meant that you lost hundreds or thousands of lives and you'd never reach that machine gun nest. Eventually, they started to adapt to these new weapons and learn new ways of fighting. At sea, what this meant was that submarines become super valuable ways to try and keep your enemy from getting supplies. They're trying to cut off trade. And so Great Britain at this point had the largest navy in the world. They blockaded German ports so that the German navy couldn't get out. If they tried, they would probably be destroyed. But they couldn't keep submarines from escaping. So these U-boats snuck out of these harbors and they started just sinking merchant ships left, right, and center. A lot of these captains, they actually become called the wolves of the sea, and they would hunt down these merchant ships and sink them. Some of them were monstrous, and they thought their job was to kill as many enemies as possible. But these enemies weren't normal. They weren't soldiers. A lot of these were just people who worked on boats. They were just transporting stuff. They weren't really involved in the war directly. So some of these U-boat captains were a little bit more honorable from our perspective. One of them, ironically, one of the ones that is viewed as one of the worst monsters because of a mistake on his part. Anyway, he was kind of a nice guy when you're thinking about somebody sinking boats. He was pretty famous actually for when he found a merchant ship by itself, he would surface and he would get the attention of the ship and say basically to them, "Hey, I'm going to sink your boat. You should get off." And he would give them a few minutes to evacuate, and then he would sink the boat. One time he actually did this and dragged the lifeboat of the sailors into a busier part of the ocean so that they could be picked up faster. So kind of a cool guy. He would end up actually sinking the Lusitania later, which we'll get to more of, but he thought it was a battleship and sunk it, but turned out to be a cruise ship. Killed a lot of people. But these were scary. If you are on the ocean, that was your biggest fear, was a German U-boat. Some of them would sink sink your ship without any warning at all, which would be really terrifying if you, as you can, I'm sure, imagine. But trench warfare becomes kind of the main way that fighting happens. Instead of having your men charge that machine gun, it would be safer for you to dig trenches and try and wait out the enemy, or wait until you had enough tanks to charge them. Because going out into the open was suicide at this point. You would not make it hardly ever. So both sides began digging these elaborate fortifications that we now call trenches. They're designed to basically contain everything your army would need and not force you to put your head above the ground. They would look like this. Now, this can be kind of confusing when you look at it. This is not dug underneath the ground. It looks like it's like an ant's nest here or something like that. But imagine yourself looking at it like if you're in an airplane, you're above the trenches, and this is what you would see. So these are just like big ditches that they've built. But this kind of shows you what they would look like. Notice the front row. I mean, there's the no man's land in the middle. It's got barbed wire there because a lot of times they'd actually throw obstacles up there like that to keep the enemy from charging them. No man's land, you didn't go there. If you go there, you're dead. No men are alive up there. That's why it's called no man's land. But this front line, you'll notice, has kind of the zigzag shape. The reason they did that is because if you dug a straight line, if one round of artillery, for example, hit right in there, that shrapnel would go in every direction as far as it could go, and it would take out a lot of people. But if you have these zigzags, it would stop at that zag or zig, whichever one you prefer, and it wouldn't go any further. So it would hurt some of your men or kill some of your men, but it would limit the amount of damage that would occur. Also, if an enemy gets into your trench, you can defend the corners on that. Instead of them just being able to shoot up and down the entire line, you can kind of stop them at those corners, hopefully. Anyway, they would dig these trenches further and further back so that you had kind of like a city almost built there where you could get all the way to the front lines without ever being at risk of being shot at. And also, if the front line was taken, you could defend the second line. It's not as easily defensible, but if your enemy gets into your first trench, they've probably taken a lot of losses. So you can defend it a little bit better that way with that second line there. It was also a great way to communicate, right? So instead of having to walk up and down that dangerous front line, if any messages needed to be moved or supplies needed to be moved, you'd use those further back trenches to facilitate that. And this on the numbers on the right side, you'll notice that it says how long on average people spent in each of those areas. One of the really sad things about this type of warfare is humans weren't really designed for this. We weren't made for this. And there's a sad statistic. I believe it's about 25% of soldiers would actually die their first day in the trenches, or 25% of casualties or something like that were actually the first day they were in the trench. And it's because you weren't used to crouching down. These trenches were mostly they were about 5 feet-ish deep. So you had to kind of crouch in there all the time. But most of these new kids, when they come in, they wouldn't know that. They wouldn't automatically know that, if that makes sense. Like you would know that, like you are like, oh, I need to crouch. But if you stood up randomly, then also you wouldn't naturally crouch. And so some of these guys got taken out by snipers when their heads popped up on their first day. Then they learned really quickly to crouch. Sad. But anyway, both sides end up using trench warfare. This changes a lot about the war. Basically, now you could potentially lose hundreds of thousands of soldiers and never move. You would stay in that trench and never move. You would make a charge or two, they would make a charge or two, but nobody would actually move at all. And you might lose hundreds of thousands of people for that. Winning a battle now is almost impossible. Trenches make it so that you're not going to lose a battle, but because the other side has trenches too, you're also not going to win the battle. It just kind of ends up becoming a stalemate for everybody. And like I mentioned earlier, that land in between the two is called no man's land. You don't go up there. There's one major exception that was kind of a cool story. On Christmas Day one year, one part of the line in France, the two sides actually called like an impromptu peace agreement for that one day. And they actually went out into the middle of the no man's land and played soccer with each other. So kind of an interesting thing. They were trying to kill each other the day before. And then they're up there just, playing a game together and enjoying soccer as kind of a way to alleviate the stress a little bit, but as a way to kind of celebrate too the holiday. And then the next day they were trying to kill each other again. Kind of weird, but kind of a cool story. I'll give you just a minute to write these things down. Okay, moving on. So life in the trenches was pretty bad. It was a disgusting place to live. Pests were horrible, especially rats and lice. You imagine all these dirty, stinky guys all together. If one of you gets lice, it's going to spread pretty quickly to everybody. But rats were probably the worst pest of all. They spread disease and things like that, but they also sometimes would eat people's feet and stuff. And they would eat the skin off of your feet, I should say. And they got huge. This is going to be gross. Sorry. Maybe this is lunchtime or just after lunch or whatever. But they got huge because they were basically gorging on human flesh all the time. Any casualties that were left in the middle of no man's land, rats would get to them before anybody could clear those bodies out. So they grew to massive size. Gross stuff. Disease, trench foot was one that was really bad. It basically is like the worst athlete's foot ever. But you can imagine all of these gross things getting into the trenches and staying there while you're standing there. That's the only way you can keep safe, is to crouch in this grossness. You had human waste mixed with blood, corpses, water. It's just bad. So on the left, you can see a picture of what some of those trenches might look like after some intense fighting. Top right, that's trench foot, but I will tell you, I chose a very mild picture. This guy's doing all right compared to some of the others. Pretty gross thing. And there's some rats on the bottom right. This dog that they're holding, if you can see him, he's white little terrier there. He killed all those rats, and the people loved that dog because those rats are nasty and very cause a lot of problems. So having a dog like that around would be pretty fantastic. All right, I got to kind of hurry here. So Germany wanted to basically knock France out really quickly in this war. They planned to just basically march straight into Paris and then be able to turn most of their attention to the Russians. But unfortunately for them, the trench system started to develop pretty quickly. So they had this big offensive. They pushed into parts of France, but the Germans never reached Paris during this because of trenches. And that meant they had to keep a bunch of forces there while they're also fighting against Russia. This is what a trench would look like, except for this one has been preserved. So you see those rocks in there. Those normally aren't in a trench, but they wanted to keep the shape of this from collapsing. So they added those rocks in. But you can see kind of that zigzag pattern, not super high. You can see it's maybe 6 feet, but probably like 5.5. So you'd have to crouch down a lot of the time. Not a super comfortable place to be. This one is important. You can see it's on a hill here. That would be a great position to be in to oversee the field, be able to do some damage to the enemy. And then there's the Eastern Front. This is the one on the east side. Shocker. But this is where the Germans were fighting against Russia. Russia was probably the least well armed, but they had tons and tons of people. The Germans were the most armed. They didn't have as many people. So the Russians sent tons and tons of people against the Germans here. They actually end up having about 3.6 million casualties during this. You can see how many forces there are there for the Russians versus the Germans have fewer, but they're able to hold that line pretty well. This is a picture of Russians running away. Now, Russia, they get quickly sick of all of these deaths. And unfortunately, I can't tell you about this today because we're running out of time. So I'll continue this on Monday. Hopefully I'll be there in person on Monday, but it may be a video as well. But thanks for listening. Thanks for paying attention. If there is any extra time right now, because again, I'm trying to time this with some unknowns. But anyway, if there is any extra time, you guys can work on the homework for today and be nice for the sub and have a good rest of your day. See you guys.